or environment editor, Valerie de Kemp. Is the European Union moving the needle on this?
It does move the needle in that the EU has long been fiercely opposed to any sort of language related to loss and damage. And so the fact that the EU, one of the biggest polluters, largest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions, is willing to move forward in that direction, I think is a major breakthrough. It is a major U-turn, but you've mentioned strings attached. I mean, their proposal, they're not just graciously agreeing to the creation of a loss and damage funding mechanism and graciously delivering money, putting money on the table. It does come with conditions. So in their proposal, they say, yes, we are in favor of creating a loss and damage funding mechanism for climate reparations to compensate poorer nations for climate-related disasters. But in exchange of that, they expect to see countries on the receiving end make further cuts to their greenhouse gas emissions. They also want to see a strong commitment from developing nations that they will start moving away from fossil fuels. So those are some of the two main conditions. Another important condition on the table, you mentioned it, Francois, they also want to see a broad financial donor base contributing to the fund. So in other words, China, India, Gulf petrostates, but also countries like South Korea, Indonesia, Russia also need to pay up. So again, let's not minimize the significance of this announcement because it does move the needle on the discussions that rich countries are willing to have in COPs. But again, whatever happens at the end of the day, countries will not go back. They're not going back home with millions, let alone billions of loss and damage money.
So again, we're following a familiar scenario. We're going to extra time. There's going to be more haggling. They'll probably talk through the weekend now.
Yep.
Based on what you just said, what are the chances of the EU and those other big players, China, the US, India, the Gulf states, that they'll agree to contributing to this fund?
Pretty slim, I mean, I would say. And I think that this announcement by the EU puts China and G77 countries in a tricky position because China and those countries have long been advocating for the creation of a loss and damage funding mechanism, but just not in the terms offered by the European Union. They say we want a funding mechanism, but paid for by rich countries, period. End of the story. They don't want to see anything different than that. What's difficult is that China wants to continue to live by the definition set by the United Nations back in the 90s that says that countries like China, Brazil, Indonesia are developing nations. And so there should be differences in how those countries move forward with their climate targets. And that's the argument being made by the EU's climate chief, saying we should be looking at the economic situations of those countries now, not back in 1992. And there's even speculation, Francois, that this might all be part of a cynical plan by the EU in order to divide the bloc of developing countries. So the EU siding with the most vulnerable nations, low-lying countries, vulnerable islands, and pointing the finger at China, saying, hey, look, they don't want to contribute to loss and damage. It's not the first time that the EU is siding with vulnerable nations to sideline China. If China officially blocks this from landing in a final text, then the most vulnerable countries will be in a very difficult position, either reaching a compromise or openly challenging China for their refusal to include this proposal. And we know, I mean, there have been reports that on the sidelines, privately, countries are in favor of the EU proposal, but publicly they remain cautious, fearing backlash from China.
All right, time limited before that summit concludes. Many thanks for that, Valerie de Kemp.